In 1950, Toyota Motor Company was 8 steps away from bankruptcy. Their debts were 8 times their entire capital. Banks were demanding liquidation. The founder resigned and took the blame himself. Dutch merchants in 1637 lost their fortunes on flower bulbs in a single month. The city that controlled half of world trade was in shock. 313 years between these two stories. Both survived, and both did the exact same thing. Not what anyone advises you to do after a crisis. The Dutch built a currency more trusted than gold for nearly 200 years until a war destroyed it. Toyota built the system that made it the only automaker to survive the 1973 oil crisis without mass layoffs. Here's what caught me about this story. The method is fully documented. Books, lectures, MBA case studies in every business school on Earth, and almost nobody actually replicates it. This video is an attempt to understand why. In February 1637, a single tulip bulb cost as much as a good house in Amsterdam. By March of that same year, less than a meal. The difference between those 2 months was the entire life savings of thousands of people. What do you do next? Most Dutch merchants in 1638 did exactly what we would do today. They chased the next asset. Coffee, sugar, herring, spices, anything to claw back what they'd lost. The obvious move, and almost always the path to a second collapse. But there was a small group of merchants in Amsterdam who refused to take it. They asked a different question. Not, what can we profit from right now? But, what does this city need so that no crash ever destroys anyone again? And it wasn't a new product or a new market. They built warehouses. Amsterdam's 17th century warehouses weren't just buildings. They were an infrastructure of trust. If a commodity was stored in an Amsterdam warehouse, it meant it's been inspected, insured, and backed by the city's reputation. A merchant from Lisbon could buy a cargo of pepper without ever seeing it, because an Amsterdam receipt worked like money. The most profitable business in 17th century Amsterdam wasn't the spice trade. It was storing other people's goods. The man who built the warehouse earned more than the man who sailed to Indonesia. The entire world traded through Amsterdam, not because it was cheaper there, because it was more reliable. They didn't abandon speculation entirely. The exchange operated, futures were traded, but they shifted the center of gravity. The real money went into infrastructure, speculation took a backseat. That's the difference between a casino that builds a city and a city that runs a casino. In 1638, a year after the crash, Amsterdam saw one of the first marine insurance contracts in history drawn up. That sounds dull today, but this is where a shift occurs that we keep repeating 300 years later without even realizing it. The entire city had just lost its money on speculation, and at that moment, someone decided, we won't be buying the next tulips, but we will create an instrument that protects against risk in every other kind of trade. Not how to profit from the next bubble, but how to make sure the next crash destroys no one. Lloyd's, Allianz, AIG. They are all descendants of a single idea that the Dutch formalized in the wake of tulip mania. Nobody remembers the names of its creators, yet the entire world lives by their rules. Speculation is a bet on the price of a specific asset. Infrastructure is a bet on the flow that passes through any asset. But insurance was just a warm-up. What the Dutch built next changed absolutely everything. Without it, there would be no modern banking system, no concept of a reserve currency. Others spent 2 centuries trying to copy it, and never quite managed to replicate it in full. Wisselbank, the Amsterdam Exchange Bank, founded in 1609. But it was after Tulip Mania that it became the backbone of the entire Dutch financial system. The idea was simple. Every merchant had their own account. Payments between merchants weren't made in coins. They were transferred from account to account. Within the bank, sounds mundane? In the 17th century, this was a revolution. The Wisselbank guilder traded at a premium to ordinary coin for nearly 200 years. 100 years before the Bank of England. 150 years before the Federal Reserve. Behind it stood not a monarch's seal, but a system that never devalued. A merchant from Venice, London, or Gdansk could trade through an Amsterdam account with anyone in the world, with no fear of counterfeits, inflation, or local wars on their doorstep. In the late 18th century, the bank finally collapsed, when the Dutch government secretly used its reserves to finance a war. But that was a political catastrophe, not a systemic one. The system itself, what was built after 1637, ran for nearly 200 years. 200 years of reliability, built by a handful of merchants who had just lost everything and chose not to chase their losses, but to build a system instead. Fast forward 313 years. 1950. Toyota Motor Company. Debts 8 times the size of its capital. Banks demanding restructuring. A third of the workforce laid off. Founder Kiichiro Toyota resigns, taking personal responsibility for the dismissals. Toyota could have gone one of two ways. The first, sell as many cars as possible at any cost, cut quality, reduce costs, get back to profit by year's end. The second, rethink how manufacturing works altogether. Toyota didn't produce a single commercially successful model in the 7 years following the crisis. 7 years. Not one hit. In a world where automakers refresh their lineup every 2 years, what were they doing all that time? They chose the second path. Taiichi Ohno, the engineer tasked with eliminating waste, spent several months studying American supermarkets. Not factories, supermarkets. He noticed one thing. Shelves are restocked exactly when the product runs out. No excess inventory, no overproduction. He returned to the factory and asked, "Why don't we do the same?" What Toyota built from that observation, you can see today in Apple, Tesla, McDonald's, Zara, just under different names. At Toyota itself, the Toyota Production System. On the West, it was rebranded as Lean Manufacturing. In business journals, Just in Time. Different names, one idea. For 40 years, Western experts tried to take it apart and copy it. 40 years, and almost no one replicated it fully. Here's why. At a typical factory in 1955, a defect was discovered at the end of the assembly line when the car was already built and had to be torn apart and reworked from scratch. Money down the drain. Toyota did things differently. Any worker on the assembly line could stop the entire line immediately the moment they spotted a problem. At any other factory in the world, that would have been a catastrophe. At Toyota, there was a cord hanging above every workstation. Pull it, the whole line stops, and that was completely normal. Because stopping the line for 5 minutes is cheaper than shipping 1,000 defective cars. They built a system where a mistake is a signal, not a verdict. Imagine you're on Toyota's board of directors in 1955, 7 years without a new model, competitors pulling ahead, shareholders furious. Would you give them another 5 years or shut the company down? Most would have shut it down. And that's exactly why most companies are not Toyota. In 1950, Toyota produced around 300 cars a month. Ford, at the same time, 8,000 a day. By 1980, Toyota had overtaken Ford in production volume. By 1990, it had become the second largest car company in the world. But more important than volume was something else. In 1980, every 100 American cars came with around 150 defects in the first year. Every 100 Toyotas, fewer than 50. 3 times less defects. Not by a few percent, by a factor of 3. In Detroit, through the end of the 80s, the prevailing view was Japanese quality is just luck. A weak yen, cheap labor, a fortunate set of circumstances. When Honda and Toyota opened factories in the United States with American workers and kept producing cars at the same quality, that explanation fell apart. The luck turned out to be the system. This didn't happen on its own. It was the direct math of a choice made in 1950. But the real test for Toyota didn't come in 1950. In October 1973, OPEC announced an embargo. The price of oil quadrupled in a matter of weeks. The first global energy crisis since the war. Every car company in the world found itself in the same position. Inventories of steel and components priced at pre-embargo oil costs were now worth several times more. Large cars with large engines became uncompetitive overnight. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler. Losses. Shuttered factories. Tens of thousands laid off. Toyota? None of that. Toyota survived the oil crisis not because Japan is better at importing oil than America. Japan imports all of its oil. Toyota survived because it had almost no excess inventory sitting in its warehouses. Just in time. A system built in 1950 to solve an entirely different problem turned out to be the perfect shield against a shock no one had seen coming. For 23 years, Japanese shareholders had tolerated slow growth. For 23 years, managers had explained why they weren't chasing volume the way Ford was. And in one autumn, 1973, everything became clear. From that moment on, TPS was no longer a Japanese peculiarity. It became the standard the entire world would spend decades trying to copy. All right. I'm about to do something you might not appreciate. If you've watched this far, you've understood the idea. Speculation versus infrastructure. Asset versus system. Price versus flow. It's easy to grasp intellectually, but here's an honest question. Of everything you're building right now, your career, your business, your investments, how much of it actually falls into the flow category and not price? Most people who hear this story will nod. They'll say, yes, the Dutch were clever. Toyota was brilliant. And then they'll go buy the same asset they were buying yesterday. I did that myself. You probably have too. Between the Dutch merchants of 1638, the Toyota engineers of 1950, and us, there is only one difference. It's not intelligence, not access to information, not luck. They didn't write a book about the system. They built it. There's a problem that rarely gets talked about. It's slow. Kiichiro Toyota, the company's founder, died in 1952, 2 years after his resignation. He didn't live to see Toyota start making money. Never saw Lexus. Never saw his system become a global standard. He built for people he would never know. Eiji Toyota, his cousin, worked for the company for more than 60 years and spent most of that time defending the system from those who demanded fast results. Are you willing to build something whose fruits your children will see, but perhaps not you? Most people aren't. And that's not weakness. It's an honest answer to dishonest conditions. But the ones who said yes are exactly the ones who built what we today call systems. Not knowledge, not luck. Patience, the one thing that can't be copied. And patience isn't about being calm. It's about going 7 years without a single hit and not giving up. There's one question I ask myself every time I see another asset that's too good to miss. Is this a bet on price or a bet on flow? The Dutch lost their money on tulips in 1637, but they won the era because they bet on flow. 200 years of a reliable bank, 40 generations of global trade. Toyota nearly went under in 1950, but they won the industry because they bet on the system. 75 years later, still a leader. Different eras, different continents, the same way out. The survivors aren't smarter than everyone else. They just ask a different question at the right moment. Not what's rising in price right now, but what will still be needed when everything gets cheaper and the next crisis hits. Question in the comments: what are you building right now? A bet on price or a bet on flow? And honestly, do you actually believe in it yourself? That's exactly what the next video is about. What this logic looks like in concrete terms today in the age of AI and overvalued markets. If you don't want to miss it, subscribe.